Hello, everybody. Welcome to Profiling Evil by Mike King. Welcome to Choir Practice. It's episode 31. And tonight we're going to be talking cold cases and how legislators are bringing some closure to families. We're going to be chatting with Senator McKell, who sponsored a bill that was just signed into law. It requires an offender to participate in the recovery of murder victims before they're eligible for parole. It's something I hope that other states will consider. We're going to also chat with podcast phenom Dave Cawley of the incredibly popular podcast Cold, the Susan Powell story. I think you're going to be really interested in what they've added to this podcast and what might be coming down the pike. But first, I want to shout out a few of you who've joined Choir Practice tonight, and thank you for joining in while a few more join up, especially to our mods. Thank you so much for helping out tonight. Miss Sophia, thank you. Heather Marie, it's great to see you. Sandra Chapman, thank you. And it looks like Shadow, Heather Marie, I think I said, Diane Phoenix. Let's see here. Wanda Walsh, thank you. Michelle Leonardo, great to have you as a new member. Thank you so much. Questions are already rolling in. Is there anything new on the Suzanne Morphew case? Maui Girl, thank you. It's just really great to see you all coming in. Again, thanks to our mods. And I want to thank those of you who are channel members, Patreon members, and all of you who choose to donate through PayPal and Venmo and the super chats. It's really appreciated. Now, I hope you will make sure that you take this opportunity to shout out to the back office. They're going to be teeing up your questions throughout the night. They will pop those up as they are relevant, and we'll have a good time with those questions as they come forward. I also want to remind you of a couple of pretty exciting things that are going on. One thing, you can still order my book, Deceived, an investigative guide to the Zion Society cult. You can get that at profilingevil.com, and I really appreciate all of you with the kind remarks and all of the wonderful comments on Goodreads and on profilingevil.com. It's really meaningful. You want to make sure you don't forget to check out Profiling Evil and Mapping Evil podcasts. Now, this episode of Profiling Evil podcast this week is focusing on the Cecil Hotel. And I'm on the air with Judy Ho, and we're going to dive really deeply into this wildly popular Netflix series in which she starred. It's been really interesting for us to work with Netflix, get permission, and go forward with this interview. And we really appreciate those folks. I think we have a little bit, maybe an image to show you what that, if you go to your favorite podcast platform, you'll be able to get that. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Profiling Evil on your podcast platforms, but make sure that you subscribe as well, because you'll get notified of each new episode. Like this Wednesday's, which I'm really excited about. Vinny Politan of Court TV and I are going to be talking on Wednesday. And by the way, folks, you can catch me on Court TV tomorrow night if you're interested. I'm going to be talking with Vinny about the Derek Chauvin trial, the jury selection that's going on, and the real challenge to that case, which is proving whether Chauvin understood what he was doing when he placed his knee on George Floyd's neck. And of course, make sure you're tuning into Mapping Evil for my newest episode that was released 4 hours ago. It's called Location, Location, Location. And the episode focuses on a serial sexual predator and the interviews I conducted with him here in the United States. We're going to then go down under, where we'll examine the murder of Queensland's Mima McKim Hill, a young woman who was murdered there in 1967 that still plagues the country. We thought we'd just play a few 30 seconds or so of that podcast. So let's just listen in real quickly. And Ms. Tammy, thank you so much for that super sticker. So we looked for homes that weren't occupied to draw the real estate agent in and then to have him there by himself where he could assault them.
the podcast where we learn about some of the world's most appalling crimes.
And he drove around neighborhoods and looked at the for sale signs so that he could see and pick the next victim.
And navigate how geography can hold the key to solving them.
That's what we would do today with GIS, is we would start to look at the things like, what are the preferential victim characteristics? Who are the people that are showing houses or that would be potentially fitting within that preferential victim? And most importantly, was the home occupied or was it an empty cell?
Episode 3, location, location, location.
All predators seem to kind of intrinsically learn how to successfully commit crimes. Their goal is always self-satisfaction and self-preservation. Well, there you go, folks. So I hope you'll go out there, go to your favorite podcast platform and check out Profiling Evil, Mapping Evil. And now I want to take advantage of bringing in our special guest, Senator Michael McKell, and journalist and podcast creator of Cold, Mr. Dave Cawley. And thank you both for joining today. Senator, how are you?
I'm doing great, Mike. It's good to be with you today, and I've enjoyed visiting with you already.
Well, thanks, Dave. How are you?
I'm good. I feel like I should have the first name Mike to be part of this conversation, but I'll be the odd man out tonight, I guess.
It's not too late.
I'll tell you, you're certainly not the odd man out, because I just was just blown away when I saw the latest numbers on Cold. More than 45 million people have been downloading and listening to your podcast, and that is absolutely incredible. What a compliment to you and your team, and what a compliment to Susan Powell that this many people in the world know her story and know what happened there. So thanks a lot, bud. Appreciate you being on.
You bet. Thanks, Mike. And Mike.
Senator McKell, I'd like to tell everybody just a little bit about you, if I could, and then we're gonna dive right into some questions that I've got for you. Senator McKell, folks, is an attorney by profession. He serves as an adjunct professor at Utah Valley University, but he's also a state senator in my home state, the state of Utah. He's a board member of the Spanish Fork Chamber of Commerce, the Utah Association for Justice, and a member of the Central Utah Bar Association. As a senator, he serves on the Business, Economic Development, and Labor Appropriations Committee. He also serves on higher education, on the Senate Ethics Committee, along with a host of other assignments, Senator. And your accolades and awards, especially in the legal profession, are just so impressive. But the thing that I want to just thank you for, having come from a law enforcement profession, having worked with the legislature for many years during the time I was at the Attorney General, is I want to just tell you how much I appreciate the fact that you are a friend to law enforcement, which is so evident by your overwhelming support by them.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your kind words.
Well, it's an honor. And folks, Dave Cawley has been working in journalism since his graduation from the University of Utah in the early 2000s. He was a street reporter for nearly a decade, and then about a decade ago, Steve, is that right? You went to KSL, where you've worked as executive producer on the afternoon news, but you're now the executive producer of digital content, where you're overseeing all of KSL's investigative podcast efforts. And one of the things I don't know that many people know about you, Dave, that I think's pretty darn cool, is that while you enjoy backpacking in the high country and down in the deepest canyons of Utah, you're really pretty well known for your nature photos, which are exhibited in museums all around the state.
That's maybe overstating it a little, but I've been very gratified to have a couple photos up publicly a place or two. Yeah, it's kind of the way that I keep my brain sorted when dealing with all this kind of unfortunately nasty material, right? Is you got to have something that counterbalances. So, well,
you do. And thank you, Senator McKell. Now for you, that counterbalance is like you're an avid runner, aren't you? And aren't you preparing for like a race in Iceland or something?
I am, if I don't break. So we'll see how we do.
Well, running in Utah snow will maybe help you prepare for Iceland. Yeah. I don't know. Well,
We hope so. We hope COVID's okay and I can get into the country. I think they'll let me in.
I think they'll let you in
I'm
as
going to tell
well.
them I know Dave, and then they'll let me in because Dave's got more followers than anybody out there and more views. So I'm going to tell them I know Dave.
That's probably a good strategy. Okay, well, Senator McKell, I want to get right to work.
Okay,
Tell us a little bit about Senate Bill 124. And I'd like, if you could, to just maybe give our listeners a high-level view of the bill and its significance.
So, and I appreciate that, Mike. Senate Bill 124 is actually personal to me. I grew up out in Emery County, but my family was from Spanish Fork. Grandpa's 102. He's still here today. And we had a tragic murder 26 years ago. Richard Davis, Tamara Davis lost their daughter, Kipland. I know Richard. I've known Richard for years. Our big celebration in Spanish Fork is the rodeo. My seats are next to Richard and Tamara's seats. And for the last 26 years, Richard and Tamara have left the porch light on for their daughter. We know she was murdered, a really tragic event. And one of the cool things about serving in the legislature, sometimes we get to do things that are meaningful to us and to our community. This piece of legislation was very meaningful to me. The bottom line with this bill, it's a simple bill, straightforward. We know that Timmy Olson came up for parole. His parole hearing was actually last week. And what the bill simply says is that parole is something that you get for good behavior. I mean, you can get out early for good behavior, but the bill just says, look, in order to go out on parole, if you've committed a homicide, you have to participate in finding remains. And you have to do that in good faith based on the preponderance of the evidence. We know Kipland's out there. Kipland's body has not been recovered. Timmy Olson knows where her body is. And at this point, he needs to disclose that. If you're gonna get out for good behavior, you're gonna get out on parole. And I know Richard Davis and myself included, we'll do everything to get him out. But we need to find Kipland. We need to find her once and for all.
Yeah, and Dave, please jump in with any questions that you might have. But Senator, one of the things that I was so impressed with the bill was that it was pretty simplistic and straightforward in what happened. If we could pull that up, I made a couple of notations here. One is that an offender convicted of a homicide may not be released on parole if the offender has not cooperated with law enforcement in recovering the victim's remains. One of the, I guess, first questions I had was, well, I know that there was no fiscal note attached to this darn thing. What was the human note attached to it? How many offenders does this really apply to right now in the state that we're aware of, or was that even reconciled?
To a certain extent, when I talked to the Attorney General's office, they had a handful of cases, less than 5 that this could have some applicability to. The bill actually came from a constituent. Richard and I, Kipland's father, we talked about doing things for years, but never really had a good solution or an idea. I had a random email from a constituent that basically says, hey, look at this law. This law is on the books. I believe it was in Australia. And I sent it to Richard and I said, Richard, what do you think? Do you think this could potentially help? And he sent it up the chain. I opened a bill file, but I know there's others out there. This should be the law everywhere. It should be the law across the entire country. You should not get out on parole unless you've cooperated in good faith. I mean, that to me is straightforward, and it should be the law everywhere in the country. And I hope to see this law work its way across the country.
You know, Dave, I don't know if you have questions here, but there are an average in the United States, Senator, of about 20,000 homicides a year. That doesn't take into account all the missing persons and the unidentified bodies that are out there. But right. 20,000 out there, there's got to be a huge number of those that are cases where a body hasn't been recovered, a circumstantial case. And we saw it happen last week in Pueblo County, Colorado, in the case of Kelsey Schelling and her boyfriend, the father of her baby, was convicted last week for murdering her. They've never recovered her body. Now, he's one of those offenders that will never get parole as part of his sentencing. But I just can't imagine how meaningful this is to family members who are part of those other circumstantial cases where the body's never been recovered. Dave, I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm curious, Senator McKell, with the role of the Board of Pardons here. I mean, obviously, in the language of the bill, it says by a preponderance of the evidence. How do you anticipate that the Board of Pardons will kind of look at this law and gauge whether or not somebody coming forward in a hearing will have exhibited that kind of behavior?
Right. And that's a great question, Dave. And in front of the hearing, for example, Timmy Olson, he did have an opportunity with an attorney present. They could have made their case, and they can still do that. And we hope that he still, during his hearing, he was not forthcoming as to the location of the body. He still has time to do that, and we hope that he does. But that's something that can happen through the attorney, through counsel, and they can make their case. And we really wanted to make sure there are reasons why bodies could move. I don't want to sound grim. We've got, if out in the wilderness, I mean, I've got a bear behind me, and you can imagine that a body could move, but it would be on somebody that was convicted to show that. And in this case, that just hasn't happened. What happened on the ground is there were 3 or 4 different locations where there was a claim the body was placed here, the body was placed here. Utah County actually spent over $100,000 doing some excavation. And one of the prosecutors actually jumped on, not prosecuting the case, but he said the county spent over $100,000 on a wild goose chase. And I think that's what happened in this case. But there does need to be some evidence of that, and that can happen before a parole hearing.
With the families too, as you mentioned. Sorry to jump in on you, Mike. I'm just curious with even limiting. So in the case of, say, a Timmy Brent Olson, somebody who, if they did take you on this kind of a goose chase, that in a sense, I would imagine, is traumatizing for the family of the victim. And so even if it, I guess, in essence, limits that kind of activity, would you consider that a win? Even if it doesn't lead to recovery of a body, if it just kind of stops somebody who's in that situation from playing those kinds of games?
Yeah, I think so. And in this exact case, that's exactly what he did. And he had several different locations. It was clear that there was not a good faith effort by the preponderance of the evidence. And I think it is helpful. There are people who want to get out. They want to get out. They want to have their 2 days of freedom out on a hillside. And I think, to your point, I think it could help family in that circumstance.
Yeah, and even Dave, knowing, to me anyway, knowing that the expense is huge, how do you put a dollar value on continuing to try to find these victims regardless? And holy cow, what a horrid message that would send to a family if we said we've hit the dollar value limit of looking for your loved one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
Cases, and sorry to jump in, those cases are still open. This is still an active murder case. We know that we had a conviction of Timmy Olson, but we also know that he didn't act alone. And to your point, I don't know that there should ever be a limit when there is an active murder investigation.
Yeah. Senator, were there any dissenting challenges against the bill?
Initially when I drafted it, it was a strict bar, and that was probably an oversight on my part. It was the Attorney General's office that came to me and said, you know what, there may be a circumstance where somebody puts forth efforts in good faith. So we amended the original language to make sure that somebody had an opportunity by preponderance of the evidence to show that. I had just a strict prohibition, and I was convinced after talking with counsel and the Attorney General's office that it was good to have at least some type of recognition that a body could be moved, and that could be outside the control of a given defendant.
Yeah, I'd be really interested in knowing how people in the chat are responding, and I hope that the back office will pop up any questions that might come up. But once this thing passed, the governor signed it into legislation really quickly. And Jill Johnston, the bill number was 0124, Senate Bill SB 0124. and we have got this bill and a link to it in the links below. So folks, you can go in and you can study the legislation. And there also are links to Senator McKell's website and to Dave Cawley's website where you can really research that. And you won't have my marked up version. It'll be one that isn't marked up. But the governor signed this very quickly, Senator. That has to be gratifying too, because sometimes we see once it hits the executive level that there's a little bit of a pause. But why don't you maybe respond to that?
Yeah, so we did put, and you'll see, before you scroll too far, you'll see we put an effective immediate date, line 96, but that was contingent upon the signature of the governor. I reached out to Governor Cox, Lieutenant Governor Henderson. They knew that time was of the essence in my mind. And I was really, really glad. And not only did the governor sign it, it was attested by the lieutenant governor. I will say that the lieutenant governor does live in Spanish Fork. Lieutenant governor does know the family of Kipling Davis as well. And I think it was a priority to make sure we got this into law quickly. And not just for Kipling Davis, but for the other cases that are out there. But I appreciate the fact that Governor Cox immediately signed the bill.
Yeah. Judy Johnson asks, Senator, she says, I know our senator here in New Hampshire. How can we get our state legislature to do the same? And I think this is really perfect timing, because my next question was, now what, as far as how do we share? And could you kind of give some idea to the listeners how legislators across this country share powerful legislation and adopt the things that you see other people adopting?
Sure. So we're all part of a group called the National Conference of State Legislators. It's called NCSL. And this is an issue that I want to look at with NCSL. I worked on, some regulation with youth residential treatment centers. That issue and this issue are the two issues that I think that I'd like to spend more time working on and reviewing with other folks across the country and other legislators. I think this should be the law everywhere. I think it's a no-brainer. I think this was very, very bipartisan, as it should have been.
Yeah, Dave, how do we get something like this out to the masses? How do we share this messaging outside of those internal channels that the senator has?
I think exactly what Senator McKell described, how it came to him. It was a constituent, reaching out. No matter where you live in this country or in really any representative democracy across the world, you have somebody who has been elected to represent you in that legislative or congressional body. Their information is publicly available. Here in the state of Utah, there's a list of all of your state senators, representatives. Likewise, in every other state, reach out to them individually. And the other thing I would say is social media is such a great tool for this kind of work, because it allows individuals to share these kinds of ideas without boundaries. With the work that I did on the Susan Powell case, there are still tens of thousands of people active in Facebook communities around that case. And all it takes is one member of that group sharing this kind of information to, send it across that whole network and potentially get it in front of lawmakers and other places who would be in a place to take action on it.
Yeah,
totally. Senator, how would you want people to get the word out?
Well, I think Dave has nailed it. I think this show itself, I appreciate you covering this piece of legislation. It's one that I am going to take to other legislators across the country through some of the organizations that I'm part of. I think it's an important piece of legislation. I didn't realize the stats that you shared, how many murders we actually have in America. That's startling to me. There are far too many people that have not been recovered. And I think this is certainly a helpful tool in recovering the most important thing of all, and that's the victim.
Yeah, agreed. And to the back office, if we could pull Mimi J2's up, because I don't have my glasses on, so I couldn't remember. There we go. Senator, what would be considered cooperating besides giving locations of the body? What would fit within the parameters of the bill?
Well, I think if you look at the bill, you're just going to have to demonstrate by the preponderance of the evidence. We're not going to know unless we have a chance to review it. And that does allow for some discretion. I think in the example, of a Kipling Davis, certainly if Timmy Olson disclosed the actual location of the body, that would certainly be sufficient. The best evidence per se would be recovering the remains. Again, it's possible the remains could move, and at that point you would have the burden of showing by the preponderance of the evidence that a good faith effort was made, and it may be difficult to prove that at some point. There may be a circumstance where that couldn't be shown and parole wouldn't be granted, but I would think in most cases I would hedge my bets that people aren't moving bodies once they're disposed of out there, and just horrible like that.
Yeah, I'm thinking out loud here for a moment, but I'm wondering if there's a process now to go back and, again, for lack of a better word, reconcile those cases where this bill would now fit, and go back in and interview the offender in those cases to reintroduce to them what some of the possibilities are. For some people, it might be disturbing to think that we would look for a way to release offenders earlier, but if they've reached their minimum mandatory, which is requirement of the law,
right,
why wouldn't we try to help these families get closure?
Right. And to answer that question, Mike, these folks are going to come up for parole whether we take action or not. And all this does is simply says when you come up for parole, when you finally get your shot to show that you've been good and your behavior's been appropriate, this is an extra tool to say, you know what, it hasn't quite been good enough unless you cooperate at this point.
Yeah. Well, I know General Reyes, and I would hope that instruction to his team and to cold case units across the state is to look at those cases and maybe go out and re-interview those offenders and open this doorway up. Heather Marie is asking, is the victim's family still taken into consideration for the parole process, or is it just based on the behavior and the fact that they helped find that body, Senator?
Well, and Mike, that's a good question for you to answer too. I know you've got a background in law enforcement, but typically with parole, we families do get an opportunity to address the parole board. But the idea behind parole is for that person who's been convicted to show to the parole board that they've made some reconciliation, they've made progress, they've been good, and they're someone deserving of that opportunity. It really focuses while the family is taken into consideration and they have a chance to be there. The focus of parole really is on that person who's convicted and the life changes that they've made, and that's where it's hard, because I think the most important, and in our case of Timmy Olson, Kipling Davis, the single most important thing he could do at this point is disclose where Kipling is.
Yeah, agreed, Senator. I look at this and I think, number one of the other pieces of this legislation that I really liked was that it doesn't separate the victim from that victim process in this whole thing. They still have a chance to testify before the Board of Pardons. They still have a chance to write in and be represented. And so they're not just simply cast aside and we just say, let's find a body and release dangerous felons. The parole board is not going to do it just because that happens. There has to be a fully dedicated change of behavior in those people. Dave, I don't know, any thoughts for the senator on this?
Senator, I think this is a really interesting bill, and I've been following the Kipling Davis case myself for a long time. I actually remember being on the steps of the Moss Federal Courthouse, 10, 12, however many years ago that was, that this case actually went to the court. And my sense at the time, and I think the sense of a lot of people in the community, was somebody is being held to justice for this crime. It's a matter of time before we have the answers. And yet here we are all these years later, and we don't yet have those answers. And I know just from my own work talking to I've actually, talked to Kipling's sister in the last couple of years about how this has continued to affect her. And so I think for many of us, it's hard to imagine what it would be to lose that family member. And so just to have somebody in a position to advocate for them at the state level, I have to imagine you've heard, messages of thanks and support from some of those people. And if not, I hope you do hear that.
I have, and I love the Davis family. I love Richard and Tamara. I know Kipling's parents. They're appreciative. They were at the parole hearing, and Richard made some comments at the parole hearing, and they're very much aware of it. This issue. I mean, again, I started with this, and I just reiterate, this one hit really close to home to me. When I presented on the Senate floor, it was a difficult bill for me to present because I see the grief that the parents still suffer, and it's a hard one. It's tragic in every possible way, and I agree with you, Dave. I think a lot of people 10 years ago, 12 years ago thought that we'd finally see some closure. You had several folks that were convicted of perjury, and you had four different high school kids, and I think we all thought at some point somebody would finally talk, and that just hasn't happened at this point. I think that's really, really tragic. And I appreciate some of the comments that I'm reading that, when somebody's convicted of murder, they should never get out. I certainly am sympathetic to that. I'm sympathetic to where we're at in this case. And I hope it's a tool. It's not too late. We had a parole hearing, but it's not too late to do the right thing in this case. Certainly not.
Yeah. Well, folks, we're talking with Senator Mike McKell of the Utah State Legislature and Dave Cawley of KSL News and the creator of the podcast Cold, which initially started with Susan Powell's investigation. Senator, I have just maybe one or two more questions, and I apologize because you've gone a little longer than you had time for tonight. But this bill absolutely has to be replicated, and I laud you for and applaud you for your effort in getting this through the system. We have watched a number of cases recently. One that I just spoke about in Pueblo, Colorado, another in Chaffee County, Colorado, Suzanne Morphew, who disappeared a year ago on Mother's Day. And at some point, I firmly believe it will become a circumstantial case. And this bill is really built for circumstantial cases.
It is.
As a lawyer and as a lawmaker, how is this going to impact, do you think, those circumstantial cases in the future?
Well, I think more than anything, it's going to be a tool. It's going to be able to be used by law enforcement. It wasn't there early on, and I look at Timmy Oltz and some of these other kids. I think that really could have been used as a tool early on. I know there was I think he pled guilty to the manslaughter, 15 years, which is a crime under homicide under the definition. But I think when I look at this case, that it should have been a tool back then, and it wasn't. And I think that's really tragic. I mean, the tragedy just continues, unfortunately.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. Any thoughts? And I'd like to kind of shift gears and talk about another cold case. And Senator, please stay as long as you want, as long as your meetings will allow you to.
I appreciate that, Mike. My thought on this whole bill and this whole situation is just, as the senator just indicated, somebody in Timmy Brand Olson's shoes at the beginning of his sentence, knowing that he might potentially get more leniency from the parole board based on that cooperation, I would imagine that incentive is greater at the beginning of a sentence than toward the end, which is kind of where we find ourselves now. But as you pointed out as well, the circumstantial cases, nobody cases, just to be convicted on a nobody case is that's a significant hurdle to have met. So anybody in this narrow circumstance facing these kinds of penalties for that crime, they've already been convicted on what has to have been a very strong case. And so you're just kind of putting that carrot on the stick, hoping that somebody's going to come forward. And I can't tell you the number of times, like I said, that I've sat and talked to family members of people who have lost loved ones to violence this way, and how much just that recovery means to them. I honestly don't think I or anybody else can really comprehend what that feeling is, that left open sense of not being able to know where your loved one is just horrid.
Yeah. Senator, I'm gonna let you off the hook with a commitment that you'll come back onto Profiling Evil at some point in the future. But are there any comments you'd like to leave us with?
No, I appreciate both of you for bringing great awareness to this issue. I mean, you're both giants in this field, and Dave, your work on Susan Powell is tremendous, and there's still far too many unanswered questions there, despite all of the good work of law enforcement and the media. I think one of the things that I think is important as I've worked on issues in the legislature, the role of the media really is important, covering issues and keeping awareness to these issues. So I appreciate both of you. When you asked how do we push this out across the country, this is how. With that, I'm gonna let you go. My connection's been a little worse than both of you, I think, but I'm gonna let you get to Dave. Dave's got, he's got a fascinating stuff still to cover. But I appreciate both of you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, folks. We'll say goodbye to Senator Mike McKell and wish you a great evening this evening, Senator. Dave, I'll tell you, that's just an impressive piece of legislation. I was so stinking excited when that came across the governor's desk.
It's incredible to me just how simple a bill. I mean, you heard him say it and you put it up on the screen there. It really is just 2 lines. But the potential impact of those 2 lines is really great, and especially great for, again, those families who are in this situation. I mean, it's one of those simple tweaks that doesn't seem to draw a whole lot of controversy. Any other year in the legislature, it probably would have passed by without a whole lot of attention by the media, without that one case that really jumps out and says, hey, look, this is why it matters. So to be able to look at the Kipling Davis case specifically, but also know its application in other similar cases, it does seem to be kind of a no-brainer.
Yeah. Well, let's make a little bit of a lane change here. But folks, if you know anything about Kipling Davis's case, because as of today, Dave, I received an email from someone with a tip that we'll move on. But if you know anything, folks, please reach out to the Utah County Sheriff's Office and share that information. But I want to shift now to cold. And Dave, if you would just fill in the 1 or 2 people on this line that may not know what cold is, but let's talk a little bit about who Susan Powell was and what motivated you to create this podcast.
Yeah, you bet. So Susan Powell was a mother of 2 boys, Charlie and Braden. She was wife to Josh Powell. Her husband and their 2 young kids lived in West Valley City, Utah, up until December of 2009. On the morning of December 7th, 2009, Susan didn't show up for work. Her boys didn't show up for daycare. Josh Powell didn't show up for work. And their daycare provider, Debbie Caldwell, became concerned. She notified their emergency contact, who was Josh's sister, Jennifer Graves. And Jennifer, along with Josh's mom, contacted police, which triggered a missing persons investigation. The very short version of this, Josh Powell claimed to have no knowledge of what had happened to his wife. He very quickly thereafter packed up his kids. He headed to Washington State, and while under a cloud of investigation, suspicion that he might have murdered Susan, he ended up killing his children and taking his own life in February of 2012. Fast forward a year or so, West Valley City Police at that point exhausted all of their leads. They released a partial version of their case file publicly. And that for me was kind of the impetus to start really digging into the case, looking for pieces of evidence and other things that had not been publicly disclosed, talked about to that point. I was doing that in addition to my day job at KSL for quite some time before around about 2016, 2017, receiving a green light from my news director to begin working on what ultimately would become it keeps growing. It was originally an 18-hour podcast series, but with some bonus episodes, it's now beyond 20 hours of storytelling, really laying out Susan's experience in her marriage, the abuse that she endured, all of the things that were happening behind the scenes that we didn't know about in the investigation, and ultimately bringing it forward. Late last year, a judge in Washington State was involved in a controversial decision to cut back a jury award that had been made to Susan's parents, who had sued the state of Washington over the wrongful death of her sons at the hands of their father. So continuing updates in this case, and ultimately no one to this day knows where Susan's body is, and we're all still waiting for that final answer.
Yeah. You know, I want to take you back to the day that Josh killed the boys and himself. Where were you when the news came to you, and what happened in your gut when that happened?
So I was in between jobs. I had left working for a radio station in West Valley, not too far from where Josh and Susan lived, and was about to begin my time at KSL. So I was just a couple weeks shy of starting with KSL. I remember clearly sitting on the couch. It was Super Bowl Sunday, and pretty much everybody who followed this case has a story of exactly where they were on that Super Bowl Sunday. And the breaking news came up, and originally it was a shot of smoke and some flames rising over the pine trees from the city of Graham, Washington, and a breaking news alert that said there was a fire at the home of Josh Powell. And my immediate reaction as somebody who had been following the case, covering it here and there, was, oh, this is not good. This is really not good. And we very quickly learned, of course, that it was the worst possible kind of not good.
You're right. I think most people can tell you defining moments of where they were when something, some big thing happens. And I remember as well where I was. But you now have released some new content. You thrilled a lot of people by bumping up a couple more episodes into this. And as we were talking earlier, you talked about one of those episodes in more detail, really looks at the psychology behind some of the conversations that were going on. Anything you can share there, or should we just have them listen?
No, absolutely. I'll kind of give you the broad picture of what this episode was. When I was researching the Powell case, one of the things that I came across in the West Valley City Police documents was mention of audio journals that Josh Powell had recorded. It wasn't clear originally what those were about, when he had recorded them, if they were in any way relevant. So using some public records requests, I was able to obtain copies of those recordings, which had never been released before. Anybody that's listened to Cold knows they kind of became a real backbone of the narrative, especially telling Josh and Susan's early story. But because of the way Josh recorded these, it wasn't something where I could just put out in its full form one of these recordings, because he's talking about, individuals, private citizens who don't deserve to have their name and information just splattered across the open web that way. And so what I did was I shared one of these. It was about an hour and 20-minute long recordings with a psychologist, a clinical psychologist named Matt Woolley. And he listened, and then we sat down and we basically compared notes and talked through what he heard, what behavioral things he noticed listening to Josh Powell's audio journals, and what does that reveal about the way Josh saw the world, the way he viewed his family relationships, the way he looked at Susan, and kind of this development of Josh Powell's narcissistic personality. And so it's interspersed with clips from that audio journal. You really get a sense, I think more so than in the main run of the narrative in the podcast, of kind of how boring some of these recordings are. I mean, it's just Josh Powell for an hour talking about, his system of multiple debit cards to keep himself from compulsively spending too much. I mean, just the most mundane topics. But yet when you step back and you look at them from a broad perspective, you go, wow, this really tells me a lot about how this guy ticked.
Yeah. This case was so darn compelling, and I have really been focusing a lot lately on circumstantial cases because of what's been happening in Pueblo, what I believe will happen in Salida. Tell me from your perspective, would we have made it to a circumstantial case by now in Susan Powell's case?
Mike, that is such a great question. From the conversations that I've had with people who were in positions to make those calls, so the detectives working the case, some of the folks at the Attorney General's office, or excuse me, the District Attorney's office in Salt Lake County, they fully expected that they would have had a criminal case ready to file against Josh Powell at some point during 2012. With retrospect, I think we can look at what happened on February 5th of 2012 and say,
Yeah.
it's entirely possible that this kind of outcome was inevitable. Josh Powell, in my personal view, was not going to allow himself to be arrested if he could avoid it. But the case was coming together. The police had done, I think, a lot more work than many people realized to rule out a lot of the other possibilities, to basically close the other leads and focus their case down on something that they could prosecute against Josh Powell. And I do think the bill that we talked about with Senator Mike McKell is, hypothetically, you can spin out how that might have become relevant in a Josh Powell case. Had he been arrested safely, had the boys been safely removed from him, and were he now sitting out on, death row or in the, maximum security facility at the Utah State Prison, wondering if he might someday get parole, depending on, however that case might have worked out. I think we can certainly see how that could have come to play.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the game in the court system that we see in these homicide cases, lower pleas accepted just because it's so hard to get over the hump. And capital cases rarely happen unless but I can't think of a capital case offhand where, and folks, a capital case is a death penalty case. But I can't think of a capital case where there wasn't a body that was recovered and part of that. Can you think of one?
I can, but they are extremely rare. They for a lot of reasons. I mean, just as I said earlier to Senator McKell, it's to cross that bar of getting a conviction in a no-body case is tough, right? The circumstantial nature of that evidence leaves open the door in a juror's mind to another potential explanation. I interact with people on social media even today who will say, how do you know that Susan Powell is actually dead? And it's a fair question to ask. You have to have overwhelming evidence that says not only was this person dead, but they're dead as a result of criminal conduct, and this is the person who's responsible and why. And doing that to beyond the bar of reasonable doubt is incredibly difficult. And when you add on the stakes of a capital case, a potential death penalty case, you're asking a lot of a jury. You have to have incredibly strong evidence to make that work.
Oh, you are absolutely right. And, I haven't seen any other YouTube channels out there really promoting much what happened last week in Pueblo with Dante Lucas's conviction. We gratefully were on the air when that jury came back with that finding. And I can't tell you how absolutely proud I was of that prosecutor for not only having the courage to blaze forward, but to pull it off, losing their prime witness who was going to testify that she had been told that Dante killed Kelsey. And then, of course, not to have a body. Again, folks, I can't express strongly enough what courage and what evidence, overwhelming evidence, has to exist in order to convict someone of murder in a circumstantial case, or as you've been calling it so well, a no-body case.
Yeah, and if you think about what could happen if you get that wrong. So It doesn't take, I think, a lot of work to run through your mind. If you're a prosecutor and you take somebody to trial in a circumstantial case like that, and you secure a conviction, say that person goes away for life, and then the person pops back up 5 years later and says, "Oh, I'm actually not dead." That that actually harms the criminal justice system. It undermines people's faith that justice can be done fairly. And so beyond just, I think, the public's desire to see cases closed, as a prosecutor, you also have to weigh that decision of, if I bring this case forward, am I confident that we absolutely 100% have, the right set of facts? And if the answer is no, the prosecutor is 9 times out of 10 not going to take that case. They're either going to, I think, as you kind of hinted at, they're going to work for a lesser charge, or potentially try to get somebody to plead out or seek an alternative resolution.
Yeah. Well, this has been a remarkable discussion tonight. I want to thank you personally for Cold and for keeping Susan Powell alive in, again, 49 million people's ears. That's incredible. And I talk a lot on this channel about the impact and the influence that this true crime community that has just exploded in the last couple of years can have. Dante Lucas case was another perfect example of true crime people who went and demanded that case be investigated further. So Cold is out there. It's available right now to listen to. The additional episodes are available, but I gotta know what's next, Dave. So
I have spent it's been tough because we've all been going through working from home, right? How do you work a case from home? But over the past year, I have been working on a second season of Cold. Once we finished looking at the Susan Powell case, or at least as much as we could at the time at KSL, we all kind of sat down and had a discussion about, where do we go next? What can we do with this platform that we've built, this audience, to try to continue to drive forward some of the good that we learned and took away from the Susan Powell case, right? I firmly believe there were lives saved by some of the red flags that we were able to highlight in the Cold podcast. So that became a real driving force for our discussions about where do we want to go in season 2. We settled on a case, on a story. It's one that I don't think many people will, quite frankly, see coming, but it's one that I feel strongly about as it's the right time to tell this story. And it's somebody who deserves the attention, who deserves to have the story told in a way that is thorough and complete. And we're probably a few weeks away at this point, a couple weeks away maybe, from releasing a trailer. At that point, the case it will itself become clear. But even at that point, I think, as you know, Mike, when you've worked a case, you can Google somebody's name and you can get the synopsis of it, but you won't really know what's in that story until you sit down and hopefully take the time with me to listen. We're looking at another really deep dive, and I'm excited to bring people along on that kind of a journey again. All right, so I'm casting my vote, and I'm going to seal it in an envelope. Okay. And in a couple of weeks, when this thing launches, can I get you back on Profiling Evil Choir Practice for 10 minutes to chat? Folks, I'm sealing my envelope now. You are a true showman. Sure. This is just because okay. Save. All right. So there. Dated. Oh, I better date it. 3/15. If you don't have like wax on the back of that with your seal on it, I'm not going to trust it. I don't believe it. If I hit it, you owe me like the biggest Diet Dr. Pepper we can find at Maverick or something. All right. Okay, that's fair. I can do that. All right. Hey, you got a minute for some questions? Absolutely. Let's ask the back office to pull them in. Chrissy, thank you for that kind donation. How many times does a missing person come back? And I'll just take this one, Dave, just from statistics, and this is over the last 30 to 35 years. We average about 800,000 people every single year in our country that disappear. And statistically, according to the Bureau of Justice, 87% of those will return at some time during the year. So roughly 104,000 people every single year disappear off the planet, and we never
hear from them again. And, I think about that. And I think that's 104,000 people. And I've said this before, is larger than most cities in the United States. So imagine in 1 year, a city just being wiped off the map. This is a terribly big problem. And while we have watched horror stories over COVID, we see hundreds of thousands of people every single year that just disappear. So, question for Dave. Thank you, Sophie H. Have you considered following the Suzanne Morphew case?
So I hate to give you the rubber stamp kind of answer to this, but I will tell you, going deep on a single case psychologically took a lot out of me in the Susan Powell case. And likewise with the case that I'm looking at season 2. I've had a lot of people reach out and ask specifically, can I work on, a lot of people have asked the Daybells, Chad Daybell, Lori Vallow Daybell. That's another case where 2 kids died. And to be perfectly honest, I don't have the heart to do it. So I hate to disappoint people, but at this point, my sole focus is the case that's at the heart of season 2. Until that is 100% off my plate, I'm just kind of not looking at anything else, to be perfectly honest.
When we were running in the Utah Criminal Tracking and Analysis Project, Kiplin was one of those names that I've never forgotten, because she was among that list. Every place I drive in this state, I go out to Vernal and I think of a woman who we recovered from the bottom of a well years after she disappeared. I go to southern Utah and I go up and I look at a mountainside. I drive through Fillmore and I look at the place where Robert Ben Rhodes was killed his last victim. And you're right, these things stick with you. And then having spent the majority of my career studying serial predators and interviewing them and hearing their stories, they are stories that you got to have balance, or your bucket becomes filled with so much sledge that you can't not have it impacting you negatively. So I certainly understand that, and I know that others do. It's interesting because we have a lot of emails that we get of people asking that very same question of, can you do something? And sometimes we get criticized because we miss the mark on some of these cases. You can only do these cases over the course of 10 hours or something and still only get so much information. I mean, let's talk Susan Powell. How many hours did you invest in Susan Powell?
To be honest, I couldn't even tell you anymore, Mike. I mean, the best I could tell you is that it chewed up 3 years of my life. And that means not just my work life. That means I took it home with me, that, every morning in the shower, I'm sitting there thinking about Josh and Susan Powell. I'm working over evidence. And I think this is true for anybody who's worked a case like that in law enforcement or in media. Or quite honestly, I know a lot of people that are just into true crime, it can get in under your skin that same way. So to live in it all the time ends up being kind of a dark place to be. So I don't want to come off that I'm brushing off anybody else's case or anybody else's trauma, because it's all serious and we should all care about all of these victims. But for me to do specifically what I do, I have to do it one at a time, or else it eats me alive.
Yeah. The question is, Dave, where can we find your podcasts? You want to just help people with that?
Absolutely. Thecoldpodcast.com is the home for season 1 and season 2. Right now, it's available anywhere you get your podcasts. Amazon Music will be the exclusive home for season 2 when that comes out. So Amazon Music's app, or amazon.com/coldpodcast.
That's great. So here's an interesting question. I'd love your comment on it, and then I'll share mine. NC Nurse asks, seems missing person cases are slowing down since COVID. Is that true, or are they just not getting as much coverage?
That's a good question. I don't have statistics at hand to be able to answer that in what I would consider a meaningful way. What I will say is, we know that domestic violence cases have gone up. That's actually been recorded. And oftentimes, homicide intimate partner homicide is connected to domestic violence. So is there a causal relationship between COVID and a drop in missing persons cases? I couldn't even begin to tell you. Is there a causal link between COVID and a rise in domestic violence? There certainly appears to be, and that's something that we ought to be concerned about.
Yeah. And I would just piggyback on that just a few weeks ago, I had the Chicago police chief on the show. He and I have been friends for a number of years, and we talked about the increase that we're seeing in violent crime across the country during COVID. Many cities are taking advantage and claiming great policing because of the reduction in business crime and larceny crime. There's no win there. Businesses have gone out of business. Restaurants are closed. But what the real fear is cases like missing persons, the cases of domestic violence, children who used to be able to report in school that there was violence in the home or sexual abuse in the home are no longer able to do that because they're homeschooled. I think we're going to see a floodgate open when we get back in business. And I think to NC and Nurse, I think the numbers will probably remain pretty consistent, and sadly we'll probably see those same kinds of numbers. Well, Dave, you have been so kind to stay as long as you have. I can't wait to see what happens in a couple of weeks, and I want you to know how much I appreciate your friendship. And I'm going to ask you again and publicly commit you. Well, not only you have to come back during choir practice to shame me, or to accept the responsibility of buying me a Diet Dr. Pepper, but I hope you'll come back again and maybe a few episodes in, and we'll talk a little more about your new case.
Yeah, I think there will be great opportunity for that. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you, Mike, the experience that you bring to the table, and the highlight, honestly. I mean, the people in these cases, the Susan Powells, the Kipling Davises, they ought not be forgotten. And that's the real risk as time goes on, as family members, quite honestly, pass away in a lot of these cases. The older a case gets, the harder it becomes to really know the person at the center of that. And so by keeping their names in people's minds, by telling their stories, I think we do a service to the victims, to their families, and to our own communities to say we're not going to let somebody commit that crime and basically erase this person from existence. Thank you for all you do.
Judy Johnson says, thank you, Dave, so much, and all you've done with Susan Powell. I'm excited that you're coming back. So am I. Dave, we'll talk to you soon. Thank you, and we'll look forward to seeing news unfold in the next couple of weeks. Have a great night.